Hey guys, how's it going? Thanks for stopping by again. Look, there was a story that happened earlier this week that's sort of flown under the radar, at least relatively, and it surrounds Joe Biden. And it specifically surrounds Joe Biden and his seeming disdain for millennials, for young people. Joe Biden has attacked young people, suggesting that they're not engaged enough, suggesting that his generation changed the world, and so certainly young people can do the same, and they just need to pull up their bootstraps, and he says, give me a break, go out in the world and change it, and stop complaining. And unless you think I'm making this up, I'm going to play you two clips. The first clip you're going to see is from early 2018. It's Joe Biden just around the time that he left the office of vice president, and he mentions here that young people really don't have it all that hard, and that young people's big failing is that they're not working hard enough to change things, and that they are too materialistic, they're not pushing for real reform, and that they are failing in their responsibility to do what his generation did, which was, essentially from Biden's perspective, save the world. And the second clip you're going to see is from just this past week, where now presidential candidate or Democratic nominee candidate Joe Biden is making a similar case, arguing that young people today are just not willing to do the dirty work of politics, and because of that, that's why they're struggling. So he says they can complain all they want, but young people won't achieve anything until they actually work to change stuff. And so again, two separate occasions here. Joe Biden, in the last year and a bit, has made this argument. I'm going to play these clips and then we're going to talk about them.
And so the younger generation now tells me how tough things are. Give me a break. No. I have no empathy for it. Give me a break. Because here's the deal, guys. We decided we were going to change the world, and we did. We did. We finished the civil rights movement to the first stage. The women's movement came into being. So my message is, get involved. There's no place to hide. You can go out and you can make all the money in the world, but you can't build a wall high enough to keep the pollution out. You can't live where you're you can't not be diminished when your sister can't marry the man or woman or the woman she loves. You can't, when you have a good friend being profiled, you can't escape this stuff. And so there's that old expression my philosophy professor would always use from Plato. The penalty good people pay for not being involved in politics is being governed by people worse than themselves. It's wide open. Go out and change it.
You talked about the millennial generation. In January, you gave an interview, and you talked about how that you've heard from some people in the younger generation about how tough things are, and you said, I have no empathy for it. Give me a break. I was hoping you could explain that comment, and do you think that younger people today have the same opportunities that people in your generation do, or are there structural barriers where it's actually harder
Well,
for
let me
them?
tell you what I meant by that. I was at a university. I taught at University of Pennsylvania, University of Delaware. And I was being told things are tough, we're not going to be involved. When I did a commencement speech 3 years ago, I was told at that particular speech that just before that, the university had just done a study. And only 17%, they're the most, how can I say it, the most progressive generation, the best educated generation in American history, the most open generation, the most generous, but only 17% said they'd be willing to run for public office. And the kids raised their hand and said, I don't want to run because it's so bad. I said, give me a break. My point is that we got up, our generation, prior to that, my generation, just prior to it, said, go to Haight-Ashbury, drop out, don't be involved, don't get engaged. We said, we've had enough. We have an obligation to get engaged. And y'all have an obligation to get engaged. So I make no apology. Get engaged. Be involved. Don't tell me how bad it is. Change it. Change it. Change it. My generation did. We got the Civil Rights Act passed. We moved into the whole across the board. So I just don't want to hear people telling me on a college campus, woe is me, I have all this, but I'm not going to get involved because it's bad. Come on.
So there's Joe making a case that millennials don't have it all that hard, that his generation, really was the one that struggled for change and won change, and that people today just need to do more. In some cases, millennials are engaged, but they just don't seem to care about being politically engaged, and because of that, he says, well, what can you expect? You can squawk, squawk, squawk. But he says millennials, they don't have a hard time. He says, give me a break. This is 100% balderdash. Joe Biden is ignoring all of the social and political and economic realities that face young people. Young people can't afford homes. Wages have not risen nearly as quickly as the cost of education, nor the cost of homes. And so for somebody like Joe Biden, who was fortunate enough to get a very, very affordable education, it may not have been free, but it was very affordable relative to today, and then got to see the derived value of that education be higher, and got to see inflated house values because his generation and those slightly after got in on the ground floor of a housing boom, and then were able to basically build equity up over these years. They also had jobs that provided pensions. That generation had it so much easier in social and economic terms. Now, if you were a marginalized person, that may not have been the case. I don't want to discount the fact that in some way things are better today. But on the other hand, somebody like Joe Biden now, with all the talent or lack thereof that Joe Biden has and the same education and the same profile, likely would never become senator. Because the expectations are so much greater today. And the fact again is that young people have to struggle and have to work so much harder to just keep pace with their parents. For a young person today, there is a much higher chance that they will be further behind than their parents were. In Joe Biden's generation, it was an anomaly if a child fell behind their parents. Working in middle and upper class, people tended to do better than their parents during Joe's time. It was still an unequal society and there were still severe issues. But mobility was generally upward. Nowadays, it's not necessarily the case. There is upward mobility, but for the most part, people are just trying to keep their children at the standards that they currently live at and hope for the best. But in many cases, people are falling further and further behind. Look, Elizabeth Warren talked about how inequality was still an issue when she was a young woman. She talked about this. But she said, I worked as a waitress and I put myself through a very, very affordable commuter college where tuition was like $50 a term or something like that. I don't know the specifics, but it was absurdly cheap. And so she didn't say that, society was perfect, but she made the point saying, young people today, a young woman like Elizabeth Warren with the same drive and ambition and intellect and talent, could not do what she did. There is a young woman today who could be the next Elizabeth Warren, but will never get that chance because of the cost of education, the cost of housing, the general cost of living. There is less opportunity for young people compared to a similar person of the boomer or older generation. It's simple as that. And for politicians like Joe Biden to make the case that young people are just whining shows that he's politically out of touch because it makes him look awful, but it shows that he's out of touch with the realities of many working and middle-class Americans of this generation who don't have what their parents have, or if they do, are very lucky to have it. He just doesn't get us. And you know what's really ironic is you'd say, well, who does get us in this race? Is it young candidates like Pete Buttigieg and relatively young candidates like Beto O'Rourke and figures like that? Do they get us? And the answer is maybe a bit better than Joe Biden, although that bar is low. The candidate who best understands and stands with young people in this race, it's Bernie Sanders. It's Bernie Sanders who, better than anybody else, maybe Elizabeth Warren is close because she seems to get that, the promise of cheap education and of those services available were so important. But Bernie Sanders gets it. This is why young people love Bernie. Young people don't love Bernie because he is very stylish. Bernie is not stylish. Bernie isn't especially hip, although he's not unhip. What they love about Bernie Sanders is that he remembers a time before Joe Biden's generation. Again, Joe likes to say they saved us all from hatred and intolerance and inequality, but it was Joe Biden's generation that voted for the Reagan tax cuts and voted for the Clinton crime bills and led in the neoliberal revolution that created this spike in inequality the rising costs of education, the rising costs of healthcare, the rising costs of living, and the stagnating, at best, wages for most working and middle class people. That was Joe Biden's generation. Bernie Sanders remembers a time before all that. And Bernie Sanders is telling people that we don't just have to be nostalgic about the past. But he does say that there are lessons from the 60s and 70s about things we can do today. Free or very cheap university, more social equality, stronger and more plentiful unions. All of these things could exist today and even stronger if we tap into those energies from the recent history of America. Bernie Sanders is the candidate for millennials, even though he's the oldest man in the race. And Joe Biden, as I believe he's the second oldest person in the race, just doesn't get it. He either doesn't get it, which is sad and should disqualify him from the race, or he doesn't want to admit that young people have it tough, which is infuriating, and it should disqualify him from the race. Young people in both Canada and the United States are becoming the biggest voting bloc, at least potentially. If millennials came out and voted in sufficient numbers, they would be the biggest bloc. And so we have to ask ourselves, if you're, who are you going to support for your party nomination if you're an American millennial? It certainly shouldn't be someone who denies the very reality that you experience every single gosh darn day. Joe Biden doesn't care about us, or he doesn't care to learn about us. Either way, that man has no room near the Oval Office at a time where young people, whether it's on climate or on education or on healthcare, are getting engaged, and he refuses to acknowledge it. And you know why he refuses to acknowledge it? It's not because he's dumb. It's not because Joe Biden is being lied to by his advisors. Joe Biden doesn't want to engage with young people right now because young people disagree with Joe Biden. Young people reject his vision for America. And so because Joe Biden isn't going to get the support of young people, he just says young people aren't doing anything to change things and they're just whining. Young people are doing something to change things. They're getting out there and they're going to vote for Bernie Sanders, and they're going to make him the nominee for the Democratic Party, and they're going to make him president. And Joe, in one of these clips, I don't know if you remember this, he quotes the ancient Greek philosopher, Plato, who made the claim that the punishment for not being engaged in politics, for not being engaged in government, is to be ruled by people worse than yourself. And it's a pretty catchy quote. And I think that's a great lesson that Joe Biden offered us, if only unintentionally. If we don't get involved to elect a person like Bernie Sanders to be the Democratic nominee, then that party will be led by somebody worse than him. And that person is Joe Biden.